Thank you so much. It's a great honor to join you here this evening in Sheffield for this discussion about the limits of equality and why, in particular, equality is not enough. Of course, equality is important. I've championed it. But in my view, it isn't sufficient. It's a starting point, but not an end point. And my big concern is the way in which not only the LGBT community, but also the women's and black rights movements have tended over the last 2 or 3 decades to limit their horizons to the narrow agenda of equal rights. I think that is a retreat from the ideals of liberation which sprang out of the 1960s and 1970s. So when it comes to LGBT rights, I say, whatever happened to the lofty ideals and aspirations of queer liberation and sexual freedom? Where have those ideas gone? Because they certainly have gone compared to 40 years ago. I would say that the dramatic shift in what I would call the homosexual zeitgeist started in the 1990s and coincided with the move into the political mainstream. It seems that greater acceptance by the straight establishment precipitated greater compromise by many LGBT leaders and activists. There was the beginning of a trend to move away from defining our needs on our terms and instead falling in meekly with the prevailing heterosexual consensus. So we've now reached a situation where the dominant LGBT agenda is equal rights and law reform, rather than queer emancipation and the transformation of society. Instead of changing what is, which is what the original LGBT liberation pioneers sought, we've increasingly merely sought to accommodate with what is. And I think this political retreat represents a massive loss of imagination, confidence, and vision. Now, of course, it's true that equality is important, but it also, we need to understand, has its limitations. Equality is not the panacea that many claim. Equal rights for LGBT people inevitably means parity on straight terms within a pre-existing framework of values, laws, and institutions that were devised by and for the heterosexual majority. Equality with their system involves conformity to their rules. This, in my opinion, is a formula for submission and incorporation, not liberation. Historically, the LGBT community did not define the values, laws, and institutions of our society, or indeed of any society. Those were defined by the dominant heterosexual majority. So if we seek equality, we're conforming to their system. Now, I want to emphasize that getting rid of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic discrimination is a laudable aim. It just doesn't go far enough. Ending anti-LGBT bias will not resolve all the problems faced by queer people, because some of our difficulties arise not merely from anti-LGBT prejudice, but also from the more general what I would call erotophobic and sex-negative nature of much contemporary culture, which of course also harms heterosexual men and women as well. So we can see these destructive puritanical attitudes in the way that often there are witch hunts against consensual underage sex involving two young people of similar ages. There's a huge moral revulsion against the idea that two 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds might fall in love and have sex. There's a moral panic about that. I'm not saying everyone takes that view, but a lot of people do. There's also the sex-negative nature of the censorship of sexual imagery. I would make a very clear distinction between abusive and humiliating pornography and that which is between consenting adults who have not been trafficked or coerced and who are expressing joy and celebration in sex. But the law and many social attitudes do not make that distinction. We see it also in the inadequacy of sex and relationship education in schools. It's hardly ever about sex. It's about warning people of the dangers of sex, terrifying young people to have sexual experiences. Now, of course, young people should be warned about the dangers and risks, unwanted pregnancies and abortions, HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, abusive relationships. Rightly, young people should be warned about those dangers. But the bias is overwhelmingly towards those dangers and not about the joy and fulfillment of sex, which we know from research is linked to health and happiness. Here in Sheffield ourselves, we had an academic which produced a report a few years ago which showed a clear link between sexual happiness and satisfaction and mental and physical well-being. A fantastic report which should be a guiding factor in sex and relationship education in our schools. We also see the sex-negative attitudes in terms of the criminalization of sex workers and of consensual sadomasochistic relationships. So what I'm trying to say is that the penalties or the opprobrium visited upon our community, our LGBT community, often involves ideas and principles much wider than mere anti-LGBT prejudice. It's a much deeper anti-sex mentality. I'm not saying, of course, that sex is the be-all and end-all. I'm not. It's just one aspect of human life, but it's a very important one. You know, for most people, the person they love and have sex with, whatever their sexual orientation or gender identity, that person and that relationship is the most or one of the most important things in their lives. I want to see that recognized and valued. I also want to emphasize that the drawbacks associated with seeking mere equality are not, of course, limited to LGBT people. They also apply to women who are often forced to compete on male terms to get ahead in the workplace, and to black and ethnic minority people who tend to only succeed if they adopt a white middle-class lifestyle and assimilate into the dominant Anglo-Saxon culture. We all know that women and ethnic minorities have learned to their cost that the equal right to gender is often not about respecting and embracing difference, but obliterating it. Where's the dignity in that? How can we have any self-respect if we sacrifice our queer identity and culture for the sake of parity? It is acceptance but at a price that I would argue is not worth paying. So if you look at equal rights across the board, we can see that in so many instances, equal rights do not equate with genuine freedom. Despite formal legal equality between the sexes, women's earnings are on average still only about 4/5 of men. There is an epidemic of sexual and domestic violence against women, even though women have had formal legal equality for decades. Likewise, if we look at the United States, 5 decades after the end of racially discriminatory statutes in America, the informal segregation of black and white communities is in many areas as great as it was in the 1950s. And the black underclass is locked out of economic success as much as it was prior to the start of the civil rights movement. As is often quoted, it might be a slight exaggeration, but it's alleged that there are as many young black men in prison in America as there are young black men in university. That is a shocking indictment of a subtle, hidden racism, which formal legal equality has not addressed, let alone remedied. So looking at the women's movement and the black movement, these are lessons that LGBT people ignore at our peril. The same fate awaits us if we jump uncritically on the equality bandwagon. Sure, we will end up with equal rights, but within a fundamentally unjust society where the rules are skewed against sexual choice, empowerment, and self-determination. Individual people in our community and other communities will continue to lose out. Now, I look back over the last 2 or 3 decades and I see the trend, the changes, many of which are welcome. I'm really glad that much discrimination, in fact, all major discrimination against LGBT people, has been repealed. That's fantastic. I and you and many others fought for that. But look at how it's happened and the consequences. To me, equality has often been a political deal for LGBT people that leads to social assimilation. As a condition of equal treatment, we LGBT people are expected to conform to the straight system, adopting its norms and aspirations. We see this very clearly in the dominant LGBT issues of the last decade: same-sex marriage and same-sex families with children. Of course, I support those, but they are very much a heteronormative agenda. And the end result is an increasing LGBT co-option and invisibilization. We become like straights. Now, people want to become like straights, that's their choice. We live in a free society. But I just ask myself, what about the unique insights, the positive things that LGBT culture has evolved over the centuries? Should we just surrender all of that? Yes, we've got equality. But the price we've often paid is the surrender of our unique, distinctive queer identity, lifestyle, and values. The important insights and ethics that we as an LGBT community have forged in response to exclusion and discrimination by a hostile straight world. faced with that oppression, we developed our own subculture with our own way of doing things and thinking about things. And I think many of those aspects of queer culture are worthy of retaining. The unwritten social contract at the heart of LGBT law reform is that we queers will behave respectably, that we will comply with the heterosexual moral agenda. So, no more cruising, orgies, or sadomasochism. None of those nasty, unrespectable things. We have to put that aside. That gives us a bad name. We must disavow them. If we want acceptance, we have to be good queers, not bad queers. And of course, in return, the good gays are afforded equal treatment. Meanwhile, all the sex-repressive social structures, institutions, and moralities remain intact. And the bad gays remain sexual outlaws. Beyond the mainstream, even beyond and disowned by our own community. The problem with this nouveau LGBT reformism is that it involves an abandonment of any critical perspective on straight culture. In place of a healthy skepticism towards the heterosexual consensus, it substitutes a naive acquiescence. Discernment is jettisoned in favor of compliance and conformity. We trade our souls for the gift, in inverted commas, of equal rights. This is no exaggeration. The truth is, the sad truth is, that most advocates of LGBT equality never question the status quo. They are what I call straight minds trapped in queer bodies. They are what I call the hetero-homos. Accepting society as it is, they want nothing more than their cozy place in the straight sun. Most are all too willing to mimic heterosexual norms. Now, of course, people have a right to do that. I'll defend their right to be as heteronormative as they wish. But I just ask, is it right that no attempt is made to distinguish between those elements of straight culture that are worthy of queer emulation and those that are not? There is, unfortunately, plenty of evidence of the desire of many LGBT people to mindlessly appropriate every legal right that heterosexuals have, no matter how crass or how morally dubious. So, for example, all over the world, a majority of LGBT pressure groups have demanded the right of members of our community to serve in the armed forces. And of course, the ban on LGBT people in the military was clear homophobic discrimination and therefore should be fought and overturned. But the problem is, those LGBT activists never questioned the authoritarian nature of the military, nor its bloody history of human rights abuses. Again, I emphasize, homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic discrimination within the armed forces is undoubtedly wrong and deserving of challenge. But so too is militarism and imperialism. Back in the days of the Gay Liberation Front, which I had the great honor to be a part of in the early 1970s, we never championed the right to serve in the UK Armed Forces. We stood with the Irish people in their national liberation struggle against British rule in the north of Ireland. We demanded troops out. We went on those marches to say the government and the army are wrong. We support a united Ireland. In the United States, the main organization championing an end to the military ban was the Campaign for Military Service. Again, I emphasize, I support what they were aiming for, but the way they did it really grated. They preached a gung-ho, God-fearing patriotism, which exonerated American excesses in Vietnam, Panama, Grenada, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Their stand was, we support the US military, right or wrong. We will follow what the military does. We will support whatever the military does. We won't question it. Now, cast your mind a few decades back, during the Vietnam War, when the United States committed horrendous war crimes, not only in Vietnam, but also in Cambodia and Laos. Many of the LGBT activists who were campaigning for the right to serve also criticized US imperialism in Indochina and made a twin-track demand of end the ban on LGBT military service, end US intervention in Indochina. I think they were right. The British Armed Forces are no better. After the Second World War, British soldiers were used to suppress national liberation struggles in British colonies such as Malaya, Kenya, Aden, Cyprus, and of course, the north of Ireland. In the north of Ireland in the 1970s, many innocent civilians were shot by the British Army and by undercover SAS hit squads. The truth about that dirty war has to this day never come out. It was authorized by successive Labour and Conservative prime ministers. These were war crimes under international law, which were committed by British service personnel. Now, I'm not blaming all British military personnel. It was a relatively small number. But it was official or unofficial, undeclared state policy. I think back with great pain to what happened in Malaya after the end of the Second World War. During that war against Japanese fascism, the Malayan Anti-Japanese People's Army, led by the Communist Party Malaya, was in alliance with the British Armed Forces. They saved thousands of our soldiers and Australians as well. They helped us liberate Malaya from Japanese occupation. Yet as soon as the war was over, they were declared the communist enemy, and they were many of them were massacred by the British soldiers, which had been their allies just months before. What a shameful, shameful history. So I ask, how can we, in the name of equality, without calling for reform, human rights reform, argue for the right of LGBT people to participate in institutions that have perpetuated such gross human rights violations? During the battle to end the ban on LGBT people serving in the British Armed Forces 2 decades ago, or more, 3 decades ago, the LGBT Direct Action Group, Outrage, did support that cause. But we also argued for the democratization of the armed forces, for civil rights for military personnel, for an end to sexism and racism, as well as homophobia. We were the only group to do that. Every other LGBT group just simply said, we accept the armed forces as they are. We just want to be part of it. Speaking personally, I don't think that's good enough. Take another issue, the age of consent. Much of the LGBT community has also taken leave of its ethical censors. After a campaign lasting 33 years, the age of consent in England and Wales was finally equalised at 16 at the start of the 21st century. Great. I was part of that campaign. But I also said, and Outrage also said, what about young lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, and straights under 16 who are having consenting sexual relationships? Don't they have sexual human rights as well? Why are these human rights only for those aged 16 or over? I'm talking about young people of similar ages. I'm not talking about a 50-year-old man having sex with a 13-year-old girl or boy. I'm talking about two 15-year-olds. Do you know that in 2003, with the Sexual Offences Act, that great, almost unremarked law reform which finally abolished discrimination based on sexual orientation in the criminal law of this country, i.e. it got rid of all the anti-gay offences, they were all repealed, yet apart from Outrage, not a single LGBT group celebrated that tremendous, tumultuous achievement. But we didn't just celebrate it. We celebrated with a big but. Because for the positive consequence of repealing anti-LGBT laws, or more particularly laws affecting gay and bisexual men, that legislation for the first time explicitly criminalised consenting sex involving young people under 16 where both partners were of similar ages, stipulating a maximum sentence of 5 years detention in a youth correction facility and placement on the sex offenders register. Not a squeak from any LGBT group apart from Outrage. Not a squeak from any other human rights organisation or civil liberties group. Now, I'll be first in line to condemn sexual abuse, predatory older people who prey on and exploit young people. But this law said if two 15-year-olds with informed consent even touch, caress, or kiss, they are designated as serious sex offenders and can face a maximum penalty of 5 years and placement on the sex offenders register, which will ruin their lives. The fact that the LGBT community went along with that is to our eternal disgrace. We argued against an unjust law, the unequal age of consent, but most were content to allow this punitive law against young people under the age of consent to be passed without a squeak, a murmur of dissent. So, when we have an age of consent, a rigid, inflexible age of consent of 16, that law applies to everyone, regardless of their maturity or immaturity, regardless of their sexual orientation. That's true. But is that what we want? Because to me, it is an equal injustice. An equal injustice to same-sex and opposite-sex young people. I want to see young people protected. Absolutely, we must protect them against sexual abuse, whether it be by older people or by young people their own age. But I do not agree with a blanket collusion with a law that criminalizes consenting young people of similar ages. So myself and Outrage, we argued that, yes, keep the age of consent at 16 if you wish, but let's introduce a clause that would say that consenting sex involving someone under 16 would not be prosecuted providing there's no more than 2 years difference in their ages. So a 13 and a 14-year-old would be fine. I'm not encouraging it, but I'm saying it wouldn't be a crime. But sex between a 30-year-old and a 13-year-old would remain a crime. So that's a balance between freedom and protection, as they have in the laws of Switzerland, Germany, and Israel. They have the same kind of qualification, and it works well. I just wish that instead of being stuck with this mantra of equality, 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 our movement, our community, had the courage to think about what is right, not what is expedient and convenient. I say this, of course, because the research shows that most teenagers in Britain today have their first sexual experience at around the age of 14. As I said, the law treats them, all of them, as criminals under the Sexual Offences Act 2003. And, for example, as I said, 2 15-year-olds can face a maximum sentence of 5 years for any kind of sexual contact, even mere touching and kissing. I think it's absurd to criminalise the under-16s in that way. We know very clearly from the evidence that young LGBT people under 16 are some of the most vulnerable members of our community. Yet, as I said, most LGBT organisations, in fact every LGBT organisation I can think of, does not champion their right to be protected against criminalisation. They seem quite content with young LGBT people being threatened with arrest and imprisonment for consenting victimless relationships. So this is the problem for me with the equal rights mantra. It helps nice, respectable LGBTIs who are prepared to compromise and conform to the status quo, who don't question, who don't dissent, who aren't awkward, who don't think for themselves. But those who rock the boat and refuse to turn themselves into facsimiles of straight morality so often remain marginalized and excluded. I would say that, without wishing to be too harsh or too cruel, the LGBT demand for equality is often tinged with a whiff of self-obsession and selfishness. It's solely concerned with winning rights for LGBTs. It offers nothing to our heterosexual friends and allies. Perhaps if we queers supported the sexual human rights of straights, more of them might be inclined to support us in return. So when it comes to the issue of civil partnerships, apart from outrage, every LGBT group went along with the idea that civil partnerships should only be for same-sex couples. They supported the ban on opposite-sex couples. And they're still supporting it today, with 1 or 2 exceptions. We relied on straight people to support us to win the reforms that we've gained. We could have never, ever done it by ourselves. We needed those straight allies and friends in Parliament, in communities, in lobby groups, to champion an end to Section 28, the ban on fostering and adoption of children by same-sex couples, civil partnerships and then civil marriage. Yet when straight people are now asking for the right to have a civil partnership, with a handful of exceptions, the LGBT community will not support them. That's really, really bad. It looks bad, and it is bad. Because it's like we want our rights, but we're not willing to support the rights of our straight friends and allies. I think it goes back to the ideals of the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s and outrage in the 1990s. Both had a post-equality agenda. Both sought an end to discrimination. But from my recollection of the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s, I don't think the word equality ever passed our lips. It was all about liberation and emancipation. We wanted to transform society for the benefit of LGBT people and for straights as well. We wanted to create a common agenda of liberation for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. We said, it's not us that have to change, it's society. We want to transform society, not fit in and collude with it. And so the agenda of the Gay Liberation Front and outrage is very much about extending sexual freedom and human rights in ways that benefited everyone, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Our idea was to reframe the queer rights agenda to make it an agenda for universal human rights and sexual liberation for all. Sadly, many in the LGBT movement still don't see it that way, if they ever did. Much of the push for same-sex marriage was typical of this short-sighted attitude. Nearly all the campaigners uncritically endorsed same-sex marriage. They ignored the historic feminist critique of the patriarchal and sexist traditions of marriage. They just wanted a bit of what those straights have. Now, I can understand that at one level. I'm against discrimination. And in fact, I have to say that it was in 1992, not in the last few years, that Outrage, the radical dissenting queer rights group, pioneered the battle for same-sex marriage. We've organized 5 same-sex couples to file an application in March 1992 at Westminster Registry Office in London. We did so for a number of reasons. First of all, because it was discrimination to ban same-sex couples. And secondly, because we knew this was a real litmus test issue, a touchstone, a lightning rod for homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in our society. And we wanted to expose that. We wanted to show the scale of deep-seated homophobia. But right from the get-go, we also said, feminism is right. Patriarchy and sexism are imbued in the history of marriage. Marriage was never originally about love. It was about inheriting property through the male line from father to son. It was about securing male sexual control over women. Now, of course, you could say that marriage has somewhat evolved since those early origins. And I've got to say that's only fairly recently, because it wasn't much more than a decade ago that male rape in marriage was lawful. And even today, just think of the language. Husband and wife. An alternative meaning of the word husband is to manage and control, which sort of symbolizes the way in which many men treated their wives. We also see that legacy of patriarchy in the tradition of the father of the bride giving away his daughter to the husband-to-be, symbolizing the passing of women from one man to another. We made all these points way back in 1992, while also fighting against the discriminatory ban. We, in fact, proposed a whole new alternative as well. We said, yes, people should have a choice to get married or not, but we personally don't support marriage. We'll defend the right of people to make that choice if they wish. We'll oppose the ban because it's homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic. But we won't give marriage a blank check. So, together with colleagues from Outrage, committed to this idea of transforming society rather than merely fitting in with it, I devised what we called an Unmarried Partners Act, and later we called it a Civil Commitment Pact. And the idea was to grant a new legal framework, different from marriage and different from civil partnerships. Because let's not forget, that civil partnerships are in essence marriage light. They're marriage by another name. The basic principles and everything are essentially the same, marriage and civil partnerships. We wanted to come up with something new. So in Outrage we thought, if we were starting from scratch, we wouldn't use the marriage model. We'd go for something different. And we asked around. We did a bit of research. And we developed this idea of what we then called an Unmarried Partners Act, which would grant new legal rights to all unwed couples, LGBT and straight. And then we thought a bit more about it, and we thought, well, it needs to be more than partners. We need to recognize all relationships of commitment and support. Both people who are into marriage-like love and romantic relationships, and also those who support each other, best friends, family members, and so on. So our idea evolved into the Civil Commitment Pact, which had two unique principles. The first was that every person should be able to nominate another person as their, quote, significant other for the purposes of next of kin status and inheritance tax. So to get away from the discrimination against single people who don't have those rights and protections in law. So if you're a single person and you die, the person you bequeath your estate to, they will have to pay the full whack of inheritance tax. Whereas if you're married or in a civil partnership, they won't. That's not fair. That's discrimination against single people. So that was the first principle. The second principle was, in the case of where people are in a love-type relationship, they should be able to pick and mix from a menu of rights and responsibilities to create a partnership agreement tailored to their particular unique circumstances. Now, under marriage and civil partnership, it's one size fits all. It's there, you sign it, that's it. No negotiation. Regardless of your personal circumstances, that is what you get. It's inflexible. Under this system, there is a recognition of the many diverse relationships that exist in our society. So, for example, some people or some partners live together, others live apart. Some share their finances, others maintain financial independence. Some have children, others don't. Under this system, each couple could devise a tailor-made partnership agreement suited to their particular unique circumstances. And of course, the great beauty of this system is the partners have to sit down together and go through each of the rights and responsibilities and sign them together. So it would really concentrate the mind about what the partners were getting into. And that might make, in some circumstances, for wiser, more responsible decisions about who they're going to hook up with. The other thing, of course, about this relationship, the Civil Commitment Pact, is that the mode of dissolution would be very simple. No lawyers required, no disputes. Either party can dissolve the relationship, the partnership agreement, with 30 days' notice. Or you can make it 3 months, but a simple way of dissolution. You just sign it, you want to dissolve the relationship, that's it. So I think that's a good example of, perhaps not a perfect example, but a good example of how we could potentially go beyond what is. We could look at and devise a new legal framework for relationship recognition rather than simply conforming to the marriage model which we have with both same-sex marriage and same-sex civil partnerships. I think also that if we do this, because we're creating an agenda that relates to straight people, that will benefit them, we will bring them on board. Straight people are more likely to support us, or certainly back in the bad old days in the 80s, 90s, and so on, more likely to support us if we are seen to advance policies which include and support them. Whenever I've talked about the Civil Commitment Pact around the country for the last 20 or 30 years, I'm surprised and gratified how many straight people think that's a bloody good idea. Some don't like it, but a lot of people, particularly feminists, really like it because it gets away from the sexist, patriarchal marriage model. I think also, coming back to equality, most of the LGBT community has been wedded to LGBT-specific law reform, to strive for legislation that specifically and explicitly addresses LGBT issues. I've always said that was a huge mistake. Because again, it divides LGBT people against straight people. It doesn't create the unity and the communality which we need for a successful movement. So when others were championing individual rights for LGBT people, protection against discrimination, I was saying, and Outrage was saying, let's have a comprehensive Equal Rights Act. Let's have an Equal Rights Act that guarantees equal treatment and protection against discrimination, not just to LGBT people, but to everyone, based on gender, race, ethnicity, language, marital status, age, disability, faith, belief, the whole gamut. And this, of course, was in the 1990s when we had a fragmented equality agenda where the laws on race and gender discrimination were much stronger than the laws affecting elderly people. It didn't even exist in those days. Disabled people didn't exist in those days. We were trying to create a new equality agenda which was more inclusive, which could build those links and create a unity of purpose so that all diverse communities work together for the same goal. And eventually in 2010, our model was finally agreed with the Equality Act in 2010. 2010 it took. When I stood as a Labour candidate in the Bermondsey by-election in 1983, one of my key policies was a comprehensive anti-discrimination statute. I was told by the Labour Party leadership, don't go on about that, that's really bad, we don't want that, that's too extreme, that will lose votes. I know from experience on the doorstep, it didn't lose votes, it won them. They're obviously not enough because I lost the election. Likewise, when the Labour Party had its policy review in 1987, chaired by the wonderful late Joe Richardson MP and Roy Hattersley, I submitted the same proposals. And again, I was told, way too extreme. No, we're not going to accept that. But in 2010, Labour, the Labour government, finally did accept and legislate the Equality Act. It's not perfect, and certainly there are some big flaws for LGBT people. Did you know that that Equality Act, in the clauses protecting people against discrimination and harassment, well, sorry, not discrimination, but harassment, and protecting LGBT people, both staff and pupils, against discrimination in education, the Equality Act says specifically these protections on harassment and discrimination in education shall not apply on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. And Stonewall, the main, most powerful LGBT group, went along with that. They did not make a murmur of dissent. And it's still the law. Still the law, the Equality Act says that when it comes to harassment and education, the equality provisions shall not apply on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. So finally, at last, Oscar Wilde once wrote, "We are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." The LGBT community, too, needs to rediscover the vision thing. And that means daring to imagine what society could be rather than accepting what society is. LGBT equality, important though it is a flawed vision, a flawed version of freedom when it involves compliance within the status quo. It betrays ultimately both queers and straights alike. It is society, not us, that needs to change. And social transformation is the key to meaningful LGBT liberation. Equality, yes, but on the basis of a new and different kind of society where there are wider, more expansive freedoms and human rights for people of all sexualities. Thank you.